Un placer para mí poder presentarlo a Nikolay Kovalev, a quien conocí hace unos años en los encuentros anuales que realiza la Law and Society, y él tiene una cualidad que me parece justifica largamente su presencia aquí, que por un lado él es ruso por nacimiento, y sin embargo vive y enseña y practica en Canadá, con lo cual entonces tiene una comprensión global de lo que es el sistema de justicia europeo y el sistema de justicia del Commonwealth. Entonces me parece muy importante que él nos venga a explicar acerca de lo que ha sido el jurado en Europa, pero sobre todo el jurado en su país de origen, y por eso lo presento formalmente, pero con esta pequeña introducción. Bueno, Nikolay Kovalev es profesor de la Universidad de Toronto en Canadá, hizo su doctorado de Derecho en la Universidad de Queen's de Belfast en 2007, es máster en Leyes de la Escuela de Derecho de la Universidad de Indiana en 2003, y toda su investigación se centra en la justicia penal comparativa, el derecho y procedimiento penal de los derechos humanos, y está particularmente él interesado en la evolución de los juicios con jurado y la reforma de los sistemas de justicia penal en los países de transición postcomunistas, es decir, los países de la cortina de hierro. Otros proyectos de investigación suyos incluyen el estudio de los sistemas de adjudicación legos europeos y la independencia de la profesión legal de abogado en los estados postsoviéticos. Así que con esta introducción le damos la palabra a Nikolay Kovalev. Bienvenido, Nikolay.
Muchas gracias, Andrés. Buenos días, señores y señoras. Unfortunately, that's what I will say in Spanish. I hope in a year or so you're ready to present in your native language. It's a wonderful moment for Argentina. I think you are in a honeymoon period with the jury, and I hope this honeymoon will continue for many, many years. Unfortunately, in some countries, when they introduce jury trials, they also experience this enthusiasm, and at some point they lost the momentum. I hope it won't be the case in your country. And a couple of words of Neuquén, wonderful place, very fertile, not only for Malbec and Pinot Noir, but apparently for the jury system. So I'm glad that we have this conference in the cradle of classical jury in Argentina. Many people say that Cordoba was first, but they were not first in introducing real jury. So anyway, the topic of my presentation or lecture, whatever you call it, is experience of some post-Soviet countries with jury and lay participation models. I think it's quite interesting to compare experience of Argentina and post-Soviet countries, because to some extent they have similar history. Well, not similar history in terms of communism, but maybe similar history going through the inquisitorial model and moving towards the adversarial model, or as you call it, accusatory model. Another thing is that there are some difficult times in your history going through dictatorship and human rights abuse on a massive scale, so it's also similar, and it's important to understand and appreciate the value of the jury system in a free and democratic state. So I was impressed yesterday with the enthusiasm of not only judges and lawyers, but also representatives of the executive branch of power, the governor. It seems to me that everybody's on board, which is awesome, and I hope that this process will continue in other countries. But now let's go to the topic of my presentation. I would like to start with the highlight of so-called 7 conditions suggested by Neil Widmer in his famous book, World Jury Systems. On the basis of other scholars, he suggested that in order to succeed, the jury system should have 7 essential conditions in place. And some of them are pretty straightforward, such as homogeneity of society, intrinsic quality of society, agreement of jurists with basic laws and support of society, ability to afford the cost of a jury system, but more importantly, the last 2, support by the legal community and will of government. And I will explain why it's very, very important by examples from 3 countries that I'm going to talk about today: Russia, Georgia, and Kazakhstan. They are all former republics of the Soviet Union, but they have slightly different stories to tell and how the jury appeared or developed in these 3 jurisdictions. So many of you are familiar with the jury 12 Angry Men by Sidney Lumet. There's a TV series from 1997, but there's also a Russian sequel by Mikhalkov, Sergei Mikhalkov, one of the most prominent directors. And Mikhalkov, in his version of 12 Angry Men, told the wrong story about jury system. So if you watch the movie, everything was incorrect. So in terms of the procedural model, first of all, there's no unanimity rule in Russia. It's a simple majority verdict. Secondly, no longer 12 angry men, it's only 8, because the new legislation shrank the jury to 8 people in regional courts and 6 jury members in district courts. So I'll talk about it. But it's, you know, you can say that it's, Russians are fascinated about jury system. And in fact, it's in history of Russian people in the 19th century, even earlier. If we talk about Kievan Rus, if we talk about medieval times, this type of models were adopted by Russians. And then at a certain point of time, when the Tsar came to power and became an absolute monarch, they disappeared. And in fact, many princedoms in medieval Russia fought for freedom for many years, and then they lost the battle and they became authoritarian states. So briefly in history, recent history, Russia reintroduced jury system in the 90s after 70 or so years of authoritarian regime by the Soviets. But they also had jury system in the 19th century. Just imagine Alexander II, who liberated people at the same time pretty much when the Abraham Lincoln liberated blacks in the United States. And they also gave the power to serve on the jury. Former slaves in a couple of years became jurors. And it was a fascinating experience. And they were quite successful in acquitting people charged with notorious crimes, political crimes, such as Vera Zasulich, who was trying to kill the general governor in his office, and she was apprehended. There were a dozen of witnesses, eyewitnesses, and she was acquitted by the jury. And then at that point, government realized that it's so dangerous, and they decided to reduce and abolish some of the trials for political cases. And Bolsheviks in the early 20th century, late 19th century, were quite advocating for a jury system. They were, in fact, like really enthusiastic, but as soon as they came to power, they realized they're not going to share it with people, so they abolished the system. And instead, they, So instead they introduced this model of Schottengericht, or the German model, or escabinado, as in you call it in Spanish. So this model was actually introduced to many states, including Cuba, China, North Korea, Vietnam. So it consists of one professional judge and two lay assessors. In many countries, they call different derogatory names. In China, I guess they called ears of a deaf person. Or in Hungary, I guess they called decorations to the courtroom. In Russia, they were simply referred as nodders, because they nod each time the judge asked them a question. They would be agreeing to every proposal. So you can imagine that they were not playing any role whatsoever, just to show that Soviet courts were democratic. So unfortunately, this phenomenon of lay assessors continues to exist in many states. And when they say that they have lay participation, it's not actually effective lay participation and doesn't make any impact on the outcome of the cases. So this is the map of the Commonwealth of Independent States. That's the term used sometimes in relation to states of the former Soviet Union. And you can see that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, several states, such as Russia, introduced jury system. In 2007, Kazakhstan followed with the introduction of mixed court system, similar to French model, which I will talk about. And in 2011, jury trials were introduced in Georgia. So, introduction or resurrection of juries in Russia happened in several stages. It started with 9 regions, as you can see, they colored green, dark green, in 1993 and 1994. So 9 provinces were selected in central and southern part of Russia, and this odd place called Altai, near Baikal Lake. And then it stopped for some years. Yeltsin government in the beginning was kind of, very enthusiastic about jury system, but then they said, we don't have funds to continue with the reform. We don't have money. And in fact, it was a very, very difficult time for Russia. Later on, however, with coming of President Putin to government, and Putin developed as a leader. He became very, very liberal, if you remember. He was very democratic. And in fact, he pushed this reform further. He introduced a great code of criminal procedure drafted with the help of Americans. The code was really revolutionary for the time, for Russia and the region in general. So jury trials were introduced pretty much everywhere in 2003 and 2004, except the one region called Chechnya, right? So in the northern Caucasus. So you know about Chechnya, about the wars, 2 wars, and it was the government was extremely cautious to introduce the system of juries in this region because they were concerned that people would acquit every single defendant. And that was not without reason, this concern, because usually in many states, in the provinces of Russia, the main evidence is the confession extracted by torture. And as soon as you tell the juries, I was tortured and my confession was obtained by legal means, the jury would acquit, right? So they were very concerned. And I will tell you about what they did before they reintroduced the jury system in Chechnya, the last province. So as I said, in the beginning, juries were acquitting pretty much every fifth defendant, about 20% in some years more than that. Then something happened. They started acquitting people accused of political crimes, such as espionage. Usually scientists working for international organizations providing advice, consultancy, were accused of espionage, including scientist Danilov. He was acquitted in the beginning, and then the acquittal was reversed. I will explain this phenomenon later. Then they decided to abolish jury system for espionage cases. And also, there were quite a few cases where suspected terrorists were acquitted. As I said, the most notorious case was acquittal of one of the Beslan postage taker. You probably remember this tragedy when the school was taken by a bunch of terrorists, and they killed about 200 children, I think, that only once a single terrorist attack. But the point was that, yes, of course, this guy was charged with a crime, but there was no evidence against him except his confession. So he was acquitted. So after that, they decided, let's abolish jury trials for this type of cases. And they did. In 2008, because there was a concern that there was a big trial coming up with 58 terrorist suspects, a mega trial, and before scheduling a jury selection for that trial, they decided to change the law, and they were no longer eligible for a jury. So, last developments in Russia, reducing jury size from 12 to 8 in regional courts, and very unusual move for the Putin's government, introduction of smaller juries in district courts, or if you imagine, let's say, a province of Moscow region, the center would be in Moscow, but the province is so large that jurors were selected from remote places, like, let's say, Nyukin, and the trial takes place only in Ciudad de Nyukin. And all the jurors will be selected from the other parts of the province. So it was not very convenient, so they decided to introduce jury trials in smaller places all over the province, which is very, very unusual given the political climate at the time. So number of jury trials are decreasing. If in 2001 there were 47 articles or sections of the criminal code eligible for that type of trials, nowadays only 19 in 2015. So I'm just trying to figure out how we do it with time. And the total number reduced from roughly 600 per year in 2007 to roughly 250 to 80 in 2017. So I'm going to talk about the informal ways to control juries. I mean, of course, there are formal ways to control juries when you have certain provisions in the law which allows you to filter certain information from the juries. But there are also informal ways or illegal ways to do that. And law enforcement agencies and courts developed these techniques over the years. And nowadays they not only adopted in Russia, but in some other states like Kazakhstan. So first of all, some of these methods were known for many, many years in France of the 19th century, intentional downgrading of offenses or practice of correctionalization, when you reduce the charge and this charge is no longer eligible for a jury trial. So you send it to a professional court, and obviously the acquittal rate is below 1% in the bench trials, as opposed to jury trials. Or manipulation of juror lists. So you include a bunch of people who you know would be pro to convict the defendant. Or even infiltrating agents in the jury trial. It's not like, it sounds like John Grisham's novel where you have, you put some people, but it did happen, in fact, in some cases. For example, case of Igor Sutyagin, who was charged with espionage. They found out, later on, the defense found out that one of the jurors was, in fact, former KGB officer who was so high profile that he even worked in Poland and tried to recruit former Prime Minister of Poland. So it's like very, very senior officers were working on this. Anyway, so another method, discharging pro-defense jurors. Let's say that you know that there's something going on and the jurors might acquit the defendant. And you know this tip from a foreman who is your man. The foreman or foreperson would deliver a message to the chair of the court, the president of the court, and the president would discharge a particular juror because he or she seems to be very liberal in the deliberation room. Or who knows, maybe there is a bug inside the deliberation room, so you know that they're talking about what they're talking about at the time. Preventing arguments attacking credibility of prosecution evidence during the trial. So remember I mentioned the situation when the defendant would say, well, I confessed because I was tortured. So the Supreme Court of Russia deliberated a decision according to which you no longer can argue that you were tortured in front of the jurors, because it's considered illegitimate pressure on the jurors. So the judge would decide whether or not you were tortured. If the judge decided that you were not tortured, you are not tortured, right? Despite the fact that you know better, right? So anyway, so if you argue in front of the jury that don't listen to the judge, I was tortured, then the judge can make a decision that there was a mistrial, and he will dismiss, or she would dismiss the jury and start from the beginning. Or, another way, if you're acquitted, then the Supreme Court would quash the acquittal on the ground that you put illegitimate pressure on the jury, and you will be tried again from scratch. Building in procedural errors, errores de procedimiento fabricados. When you a judge, you know that maybe with this evidence, with this weak evidence, the person will be acquitted. So you would build in intentionally some of the errors in the process, and then the prosecutor, allowing the prosecutor to appeal against this decision, because the judge did some mistake in the proceedings. So this is kind of, and the judges in fact confessed to the researchers that they do it on an occasional basis. And of course, quashing jury verdicts on far-fetched grounds. Like, for example, during jury selection, juror number 5 didn't say that his cousin was stopped on the traffic light, whatever, apparently it's such a horrible crime. Or you did some transgression in the past, but you totally forgot about it, and you didn't tell the prosecutor that you were prosecuted or charged with any minor crime. So this kind of methods of sabotage, pretty common in practice, and lawyers and even judges admit that they experience this. Next point, in Russia there were several attempts to transform juries into mixed courts. So in fact there's a discussion at the high level by some professors who are not really keen on to have a jury system. They say, well, we can go with the mixed court. Look at France, look at Italy, they're doing well. But France and Italy are not Russia, so you cannot compare the independence or level of independence of the judiciary in these states. So that might be the case in some future, unfortunately, depending on the political climate. But at the moment, I guess, at least presidential administration is not ready for that move. So, as I said earlier, juries were reduced to 8 in regional level or provincial level, and there are some juries at the district level were introduced, a number of 6. Also, reduced number of candidates go to court for jury selection, because there is no, the power of attorneys to select juries were limited. Nowadays, you can't peremptory challenge or challenge without a cause of more than one candidate. So let's talk about Kazakhstan. Switch gears and go to Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is a huge country with a smaller population, and it had a debate to introduce jury's trials starting from maybe late 1919, and it had a major debate between 2003 and 2005. There were 2 camps. One camp was proposing a real jury, classical jury, mostly advocates, legal scholars, some members of the parliament, but they were in the minority, members of the parliament. On the other hand, you had government, office of the prosecutor, of the chief prosecutor, and the Supreme Court. And again, 2 models clashed, or 2 ideals. Right? On the one hand, you have international advisors represented by the Americans, ABA Rowley or ABA Silly, and on the other hand, GTZ. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this organization, but it's represented by the German government. And the reason why Germans and Americans were so keen, because when you have a legislative system or a legal system which resembles your own system, it's easy to do business, because you know what the expectations from the court are. And so Germans are very, very prominent in this region. In Central Asia, in Russia, they were pushing the reform. And they succeeded. With, I would say, some shady business. They befriended Supreme Court judges, prosecutors, and they managed to push that reform. They drafted the law, and which passed in the parliament. The alternative law never introduced to parliament, which is kind of common to this country. Anyway, so until 2010, mixed courts were composed of 2 professional judges, which is kind of odd, not 3, but 2. And I think, as far as I remember, 9 leses, so there are probably 2 alternates here. So the idea was, the drafters of the law explained this in this sense: you need 2 legal minds in the jury room, because there will be no monopoly. So they will debate with each other and make kind of represent 2 sides of the story. But in fact, it was like never happened. You have one professional judge who is involved in the proceedings, and the second one would just sit and read the newspaper during the entire trial. So they didn't care what's going on. So in 2010, they reduced it to 1 judge and 10 leses. So the composite, well, the number remained at 11. And so you can see that the model of the court, it resembles the common law court, but in reality, it's a mixed tribunal. But there are some unique features of the Kazakhstani model, which is very, very unique and kind of weird in a sense. So if you compare 2 models, in Russia you have a classical model, in Kazakhstan you have a mixed court model. So one of the key features is that in Russia it's one part closing argument and separate sentencing hearing is forced to revote if they realize that the decision is not in favor of the prosecutor. So in reality, this secret ballot doesn't guarantee the independence and autonomy of the jurors. Again, special verdict rules. In order to convict, you have to have simple majority, 6 people out of 11. But also, in order to pass the death sentence or life imprisonment, you have to be unanimous. Well, death penalty, in fact, is not used in Kazakhstan because there is a moratorium, but in theory, there can be a death penalty. In Russia, if you have a split vote, 3-3, in a smaller jury or 4-4, the person would be acquitted, which is also kind of an interesting feature. But it's the feature of the French law, which was used in the 19th century. Okay, so some of the statistics, acquittal rates. As you can see, in some years, Russian juries were acquitting up to 20% of defendants, which is very, very high, given the fact that in professional courts, it's below 1%. In Kazakhstan, it's very, very odd statistics when you look at Kazakhstan. And I don't even trust the official statistics. But you can see that in some years it's 9%, some years it's 13%, and some years 2%. So not very consistent, depending probably on the involvement of the presidents of the court. So, total number of convictions and acquittals in Kazakhstan, you can see that they're very, very minuscule in some years, only 2 or 3. Another phenomenon, which is similar to Russia, in Kazakhstan, many acquittals are quashed anyway. So you can see that in some years, in 2007 and 2008, all the acquittals were quashed. There were only 3 acquittals, they all quashed. So, one of the dangers of the mixed tribunals is that the judge has absolute power of the lay assessors. And in fact, there are reported cases when jurors went to the media outlets, newspapers, complaining that they were misled, they were misinformed by the presiding judge regarding the law. In one case of Alexander B. in Karaganda region, they were teenagers, 2 cousins, who had sex, and the girl got pregnant. So the family wanted to decide this situation by simply making arrangements within the family, because there was no technical rape. They were both teenagers. But the government decided to intervene and charge this teenage boy with rape. So jurors, consisting mostly of women, decided to acquit the person. And the judge said, well, if we acquit, then there will be some negative consequences for the defendant, blah, blah, blah. So he lied to them. And they were convinced that they should convict the person, and he said that I will give him a sentence of below, he will not be serving prison sentence, but he was sentenced to real prison term. And after that, jurors were so angry, and they went to the press. But the judge was never disciplined. But the jurors were charged with violating the secrecy of deliberation room. And, fine was $80. It wasn't a big amount, but still, it's in principle, they wanted to notify the public that the injustice took place, and they were prosecuted. So that's the kind of practice of mixed courts in some cases. So, interestingly, in 2010, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, with my help, did a survey of lawyers, judges, and prosecutors. And it turned out that jurors were, and judges had very, very interesting views about independence of jurors in Kazakhstan, or lay assessors. When they asked, what do you think regarding their independence, only 40% stated that they believe that jurors are independent. About a third, 28%, said no, they are not independent. And about 33%, another third, said that they were uncertain, which means that, you know, you can see that about 60% of judges think that probably they're not independent. Similarly, some prosecutors don't believe that they're independent, right? Which is very, very interesting. So another question was, does the presence of the judge in the deliberation room influence the verdict? 57% of judges say yes. They can influence them very easily. Uncertain, 18%, and only 27% said that the presence of the judge doesn't have any impact. And similar figures you can see with the sorry, it's not a percentage, it's total number. I guess in this case it's a total number. I don't think that it's a percentage. Another main defect of mixed courts is that practice of quash and acquittals. As I said, in some cases, there are some notorious cases where the person was acquitted 3 times in a row by different juries, 3 different juries, and they were continued to be prosecuted unless the prosecutor is just tired and giving it up. For example, in the case of Aidbayev, the bottom case, he was finally acquitted by the Court of Cassation. So when the judges and prosecutors were asked, what about more effective model of lay participation? You can see that judges, 54 out of 100, said that more effective model is a classical jury. So let's move to my last country, Georgia, and then we can have questions. I will try to make it within several minutes. Georgia experimented with jury trials for 3 years after the collapse of the Russian Empire, which was in 1917. But then when the Soviets moved and occupied Georgia in the 1920s, the jury was abolished, and they reintroduced the system in 2011. At the moment, the number of jury trials is even lower than Neocan, and Neocan is, I was told that about 400,000 people in the province, or maybe less. So Georgia is 4 million, so 10 times more, but they, over the several years, they only have, the statistics is not correct on the slide, about 40 jury trials. The reason why there's not so many jury trials is because they introduced the system of plea bargaining at the same time when they introduced jury system. And the prosecutors can make an offer that you cannot refuse. Otherwise, you're taking your chances being convicted and sent to prison for life and life, right? So many trials never happen, and they result in guilty pleas. So Georgia has a 12-member jury. They allow smaller juries by law, but they are not practiced yet. It's a US-style voir dire selection with up to 12 peremptory challenges, quite generous, in cases punishable by life. And verdicts are reached by a qualified majority of 8 out of 12. I guess it's similar to Neocan, right? So it's similar law. And there is only 1 case of hung jury out of 40 cases, and I will talk about it later on, maybe. Maybe will not talk about the hung jury case. So, in a nutshell, key challenges for jury system in Georgia. First of all, most defendants waive their right to jury trial because of the guilty pleas. So, for example, in 2017, there were 120 cases qualified for jury trials, but only 9 accused applied for it. Lack of court space. Only two courtrooms in Tbilisi court, a city court, are designed for jury trials, and then one in Kutaisi, another city. Other cities were not ready for this type of trials. They were simply not ready. And one of the problems is that if you don't have a courtroom, then you don't have a continuous trial. You have to have separate sessions over 4 or 5 months due to court overbooking, and in one case in Kutaisi. Significant delays in jury selection. In one case, it took 24 separate sessions to select one single jury. Many people simply do not show up, especially during the harvest season when the grape is ripened and you need to collect it, right? So you know what I'm talking about. So many self-recusals, it's really, really bad turnout. I mean, not so many people show up. Another one, a lack of training and preparation of lawyers participating in jury trials. Only prosecutors are prepared. They very well trained with the help of American Bar Association and US organizations, and insufficient education in schools, universities, but my colleagues in Georgia are working on this, and we're trying to educate people in provinces and smaller regions. Just a couple of words about a couple of notorious cases. One of the problems in jury is pretrial exposure in high-profile cases. In fact, it's so bad that sometimes witnesses are invited to talk shows and they put them on national TV before they testify in court. And so this is the case of Magda Papidze, who was accused of double homicide, killing her husband and her child because of the love affair with another man. It's a very, very tragic story, but kind of, you know, maybe can be a subject for a soap opera, or I don't know, maybe some kind of TV series. Anyway, so the defendant was claimed that she was threatened to be raped, that she was tortured, and she was actually lost her pregnancy during the custody. She was under pressure, physical and mental. And there were some discrepancies, but the prosecutor's office released pretty much every single detail to the press before her trial, and it wasn't possible, in my opinion, to select an impartial jury in such a small country. And another case, kind of similar to, well, not similar, but very, very tragic too, an American family who have dual citizenship. They were Georgian citizens for many years, living in Tbilisi, were killed in the mountains, and the 19-year-old boy, who was a shepherd, was charged with triple murder. So once again, the prosecutor's office released everything, including his confession or semi-confession, his statement to the police, and they put on national TV. And I didn't update this slide on that, on what you see, but in March 2019, he was convicted and sentenced to life. I was at the time in Georgia when it happened. So conclusions. Well, what we think about the 7 conditions suggested by the Midmer, and what are the most relevant and important factors? Not sufficient funds to some extent. You might say that it happened in Georgia and Russia. Lack of support from the legal community in all countries, but in Georgia what they did, they fired all judges with mentality that they were not happy about jury system. Okay, if you're not happy, you're fired, right? So they fired all the prosecutors and police officers, and they managed to have them on board. In Russia, it's not so easy. The prosecutor's office and the judges are pushing against the reform. And of course, unwillingness of government to provide independence to courts. In all countries, the most predominant example is Kazakhstan. So future of lay participation is uncertain, but as my friend, Professor Fugrai, yesterday said that it's a constant struggle of people for liberty and democracy. So many people realize that jury system is the best example that you have independent courts. And as Sir Patrick Devlin once said, jury trial is the lamp that shows that freedom lives in the country. So I hope that I would like to finish my presentation on the positive note. I think it's all, maybe some battles are lost, but the war is not over. Okay, so I hope that these examples will inspire Argentina to continue this reform, and I would be happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
¿Cuál es la insistencia de que todavía haya jurados y que haya voluntad política de sostener jurados en un escenario tan difícil para, ni siquiera diría la independencia judicial, sino para el respeto mínimo de los derechos humanos, como ser, por ejemplo, no torturar a los detenidos, como por ejemplo no presionar a los jurados, como por ejemplo romper sus veredictos si no les gustan, etc.?
So why the juries are still in place? Well, it's not so difficult to abolish it completely because there's a constitutional guarantee. All the countries that I mentioned have a provision that jury system should be in place. Well, you might say in Argentina we have this provision for 150 years and nothing happened, right? In some provinces still there is no jury trial. Well, as soon as you introduce it, it's difficult to get rid of it completely. You can change the constitution, of course, but I think some people still, even in the government, believe that this system should be preserved. Because if you abolish it completely, then it might cause a new revolution. You know, you remember probably from history of the United States, one of the demands and one of the reasons why the American Revolution took place was that the British government tried to abolish jury trials in North America. So that might be a cause of a problem for a revolution. So.
Bueno, muchas gracias. No, me quedé pensando, Nikolay, en una parte con respecto a lo que sería el tribunal mixto, integrado por jueces técnicos y legos, personas ciudadanas, con respecto a la posible y a la concreta influencia que de hecho mostraste en el caso de un juez. Eventualmente el problema está reconocido, existe. Ayer cuando expuso Valerie, precisamente cuando vimos quiénes son presidentes o presidentas, se analizó eventualmente también el nivel educativo y bueno, no vimos que fuera significante y que esto influyera en quiénes son presidentes. Sin embargo, en este caso, claramente cuando yo vi la foto, en la imagen, dije, bueno, un juez técnico integrado junto a ciudadanos, obviamente por el conocimiento que tiene jurídico del derecho, su palabra, sociológicamente yo creo que tiene un peso distinto por el valor y por la preparación. Ustedes, habiendo detectado esta influencia, que en este caso fue negativa, bueno, y aparte la influencia de por sí no corresponde, ¿hay alguna medida, hay alguna forma, en este caso de tribunales mixtos, como por ejemplo hay en Córdoba? Corregirlo, ¿no?
Well, the ways to correct the influence, the main problem with the ways to correct is that how do you know that there was a problem if there was a secrecy of deliberation, right? So if you do not allow to disclose the content of deliberation, how do you know it was incorrect? Example from Kazakhstan showed that the power of the judge is so overwhelming and incredible that the judge can simply ignore the views of the lay assessors. I think if you record the deliberation and you require the mixed court to provide reasoned judgment and sign off the verdict, that might be a material for appellate review. But if you have secrecy of deliberation, you cannot look at the mistakes that they put into the verdict. I'm not sure if I answered your question though, because did I?
Yeah.
Okay.
¿Por qué está permitida la apelación de los veredictos de no culpabilidad? ¿O fue una creación jurisprudencial? ¿O me imagino que en la constitución rusa y de estos países también debe estar la cláusula del double jeopardy o del ne bis in idem, que significa que un veredicto absolutorio del jurado es definitivo, final? Y también me asombró ver cómo en las estadísticas de absoluciones iniciales de Rusia son iguales a las que hay en Argentina, parecidas a las que hay en Estados Unidos. ¿Se asustó el sistema de tantas absoluciones? Bueno, no tantas, sino de absoluciones normales.
Well, of course, I mean, when you have a practice for many years of acquittals at the level of 1% or lower, then you think that the system which allows 20% is defective, right? So you think, oh my God, what are they doing? They letting go criminals, right? So it's a mindset of the judges in the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court. They think that, oh, he's a criminal, he should be in jail, right? Why are you letting him go? Well, because there's no evidence, but it doesn't really matter. He's a criminal, right? So that's one thing. It's a mindset. Another thing, you mentioned double jeopardy rule. There are two ways to interpret double jeopardy rule. The classical American way, that if the person was acquitted, no matter what happened, right? No matter, let's say that later on you will find some evidence, new evidence that the person is 100% guilty. You cannot try him or her one more time because he was already acquitted. In Russia, it's very flexible approach. Until you finally acquitted. It means that until all the court said, Court of Appeal, Supreme Court finally stated that you're not guilty, that's the final acquittal. Until then, you can be retried multiple times. And I know examples of 4 times when the person was acquitted in a row by the jury and they would be still recharged.
Hola, sí, quería preguntarte si los nuevos paradigmas del juicio por jurado se trabajan en la universidad y de qué forma.
And the jury trial worked at the university? I didn't get the question. Gender diversity in the university? Okay, got it. So gender diversity on the jury. Well, I guess it's pretty diverse. In fact, sometimes it's dominated by female jurors in Russia because, and usually the age distribution is not very across the board, so it's not cross-section of the community. Usually more mature people who are close to the retirement age or maybe retired are represented on the jury more often. Young people, certainly the prosecutor tried to avoid. So there's no problem with gender balance, I think. There's never was actually in Russia. Women overrepresenting judiciary in the Soviet Union. In fact, the word judge in Russia is masculino, but in practice, almost all judges were female. So it's like it's a femenino word and not a masculino. Yeah. So.
Sí, escuchamos clarísimamente la descripción sobre el sistema en Rusia, en Kazajistán, en Georgia. Yo lo que te pediría es, si podés ponderarnos desde tu punto de vista, ¿qué pensás del requisito o no de la unanimidad de las opiniones de los miembros del jurado?
Unanimity rule.
Sí.
Okay. Well, I think unanimity rule is probably the best guarantee for supporting presumption of innocence. So if you have one or two people or even more people doubting the guilt of the person, in my opinion, there's a doubt that the prosecution didn't succeed in convincing all the members of the jury that the person is guilty. But it's my personal view, many countries, including some common law countries, rejected this rule. Canada, most of the United States still preserve this rule, but the Supreme Court of the United States said it's not required. It's not a constitutional requirement. England also did this, but I think it's better to have unanimity, as Valerie and some other people yesterday said that I guess it makes the deliberation process more legitimate and robust, right? That's the term. So I think it's important to have unanimity or closer to unanimity, not a simple majority verdict. It's kind of like a deciding by lot, right? So that's my personal opinion.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Nikolay.